Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Cristina Rodríguez. She is a professor of law at Yale Law School and the co-author, along with Adam Cox of New York University Law School, of a new book called The President and Immigration Law. This is a particularly timely book and a particularly timely episode for us on the podcast because as Biden prepares his transition work and is looking forward to day one, January 20th of 2021, when he becomes the 46th president of the United States. He will be working with what Cristina explains is a tremendous amount of executive power in the area of immigration law and policy. And in fact, as the Biden transition team has looked ahead and already signaled what are some of the very first executive orders we can look forward to. Several of them concern immigration policy, including executive orders to reinstate a positive and welcoming policies towards 11 million undocumented immigrants to this country and the Dreamers, the so-called DACA Act as well. So a lot of positive change that President Biden will be able to effect with the signature, with the ink from his pen, even if it turns out that Congress continues to be gridlocked. So very important and I think actually exciting and positive to think about things that could actually get done that would be good for our country starting a few weeks from now. I hope you'll enjoy this episode. A great conversation with Cristina Rodríguez of Yale Law School on the President and immigration law. Stay tuned. I want to welcome my guest, Cristina Rodríguez, the co-author of a new book, The President and Immigration Law. We are expecting her co-author, Adam Cox, to join us. He'll be joining the conversation shortly. And as we were just talking before we got started, Cristina, this is a real good time to be talking about the subject of your new book as Joe Biden becomes president-elect and is already talking about certain executive orders that I think it's safe to say his predecessor, Donald Trump, issued as executive orders, the ones that he wants very, very quickly to reverse, including some that have to do with immigration. So perfect time to talk about the role of the president and immigration, which is the topic of your book. So I appreciate it very much having you on the podcast. Maybe you could start by give us a little background on yourself and really what the thesis of the book is and how you got into this topic.
Okay, so Adam and I have been working on this particular book for about 5 years now, but the question of the president's power over immigration law for over a decade. We started the research at the tail end of the George W. Bush administration out of an interest in trying to understand how power was distributed between the political branches, between Congress and the president over immigration, based on an instinct that historically you have seen both divergence between the president and Congress, but also presidents asserting a lot of control over fundamental immigration policy questions, like who should be admitted to the United States and who should be allowed to remain. And so recent events have made very high profile something that we think is actually deeply rooted in our history. And people look at the events of the Obama years, and then even more so the events of the Trump years, and say, this is an example of the presidency out of control or a unilateral executive that's acting where Congress can't or won't because of political polarization or divided government. And while those dynamics definitely inform the shape that the president's control over immigration policy takes, the thesis of the book is that that's actually deeply rooted in the history of the country and in particular in the structure of the law. And it's a structure that has evolved over the course of a century of legal developments that have combined to put the president effectively in charge of a lot of important decisions related to the system of immigration. And it's both through the power of the presidency that we all appreciate every day, which is the power of rhetoric and the power to shape a national narrative. But more importantly, we argue by virtue of the fact that the president sits atop the immigration bureaucracy and an enforcement system that has grown vast in scale over time, and decisions about how to operate that system, how to shape it, empower the president. So that's the descriptive thesis of the book. And then we present a series of arguments about how we should think about that, whether that should concern us, and a blueprint for reform for the future, which we can also talk about.
Yeah, and I want to, and I'll just note, since you were perhaps humble enough not to mention this, that you are a professor at Yale Law School and nationally recognized in the fields of administrative law and immigration law. And your co-author, Adam Cox, also teaches in the area of immigration law, as well as voting rights. You may have a question about that later, at NYU Law School. So that is a really fascinating thesis, in that it does seem to run against what I've always thought about immigration law and who is in control of directing immigration policy. In that, on the one hand, we have this kind of conventional understanding of executive power having increased since George W. Bush and into the Obama years, and now through the Trump years, with executive orders being the way new policy gets enacted. And yet we continually hearing about the need for comprehensive immigration reform, as if Congress is really going to figure out a way to get together to do anything affirmative in the law. And if I'm not mistaken, hasn't actually done anything with regard to immigration reform since 1986. So it's been a few years. So what are some of the historical roots that you found that explain what we see today, which is it's really the executive branch that is running, defining and guiding immigration policy?
So there are three dynamics that we spend a good part of the book tracing that really account for a significant portion of the president's power, or significant amount of the president's power over immigration law. The first is the rise of the deportation state, the rise of a system where immigrants in the country, including people with green cards, lawful permanent residents, are here on a probationary basis, on a contingent basis, always subject to deportation. Before the late 19th century, there were not grounds for removing immigrants from the country, and most immigration law was actually done through state regulation of the movement of people. It wasn't immigration law per se, and through treaty making that executives engaged in, that were mainly trade treaties, but also resulted in migration and reciprocal agreements to protect the rights of non-citizens from the country with which the treaty was signed. But starting in the late 19th century with the Chinese Exclusion Acts, and then building from there, Congress created a system where immigration status became contingent, and the executive branch had the power to remove people. And that contingency has grown over time in two senses of the word. Early on, it used to be the case that the grounds of deportation came with statutes of limitations, which meant that after a certain period of time, a non-citizen was no longer subject to being removed. Those fell by the wayside. And in addition to that, the grounds of removal have dramatically increased over time, so that today there's an exceedingly long list of them in the code. The most important one of which, for our purposes, and why will become clear in a moment, is the ground that makes anyone who is in the United States without lawful status removable. So the approximately 11 million people who are in the country today without status are removable at all times. So that's the first thread. The second thread is the rise of the enforcement apparatus, the creation of a bureaucracy to actually enforce the law. You could have all the restrictive laws you want, but if you don't have a machinery to enforce it, then they'll matter less. And beginning in the late 19th century with the Chinese Exclusion Acts, but especially throughout the 20th, Congress has increasingly funded and built that machinery. Before 1924, there was no border patrol and almost no interior enforcement. The border patrol gets created in 1924 during a moment when Congress is regulating heavily to restrict immigration in various ways. And that border patrol turns into, through the granting of legal authorities and resources, an interior enforcement operation. And that increases in a somewhat secular fashion throughout the 20th century. Most important for us today, post 9/11, this is probably the most favored bureaucracy, at least most favored law enforcement bureaucracy by Congress. The budget of DHS exceeds the budget of all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. And the events of 9/11 and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security helped to drive that. And so you have this massive machinery that operates both at the border and in the interior, and that helps to create some of its own perpetuating logic and dynamic, and congressional committees appropriations committees love to allocate resources here. And then the third element of that, of the rise of what we call a shadow system, is that beginning in 1970, though there are some antecedents to this, and accelerating up until around 2009, was unprecedented unauthorized immigration into the United States. It was a period of illegal immigration to the United States. And we talk in the book a fair amount about the debates about why illegal immigration occurred in such high numbers over this period. And there are really interesting debates and a variety of factors that sociologists, economists, and historians would lay out. But the important aspect of that for our purposes is what has created this population of almost 11 million people who lack status and are deportable. And so what that has created is a shadow system of immigration that sits alongside our legal immigration system that the president and the executive branch have the power to control. They decide who gets deported, who stays. And many of your listeners, most people who follow politics or law at all today, would be familiar with DACA, President Obama's relief program for dreamers. DACA was a culmination of that power over the shadow system. It's an example of the president and high-level officials deciding how it should be operated. And it was the most significant change to immigration law in a generation. It didn't come from Congress, it came from the president. And none of that is to say, and we can talk about this if it's of interest, that the president doesn't have considerable power over the legal immigration system, but there his power is more constrained by the very intricate rules that Congress has adopted and the kind of pathwise approach to entering and acquiring status and working and then maybe ultimately naturalizing that is elaborated in the code. But in our shadow system, the code is much less relevant than the priority decisions made by the executive branch.
Well, so it seems like for in the earliest years of our country, states were mostly thinking about it, and then there was a long stretch of time when we had this vast land to settle, where probably it was a good time to be fairly lenient, or even not really thinking too much about immigration, other than quotas for certain populations that were considered less desirable. That's not me saying that, because I think Jews were among those who were
yes, in the 20s for sure,
limited in number. And then you get to this period, more the modern period, and it does feel like there's this ping pong ball effect. President Obama comes forward with a pro-dreamer program as an executive matter, and then replaced by President Trump, who reverses it. And then you have Joe Biden waiting to come in, who says among the first things he wants to do on day one in the White House of a Biden administration is go back to a pro-dreamer, pro-DACA approach to to that particular program, which is interesting to me in that we're also in an era, and I know you, with your background in administrative law, I'm going to bring that into the conversation here. We've seen the rise of these independent agencies with tremendous authority, initially granted that authority by Congress, but mostly administered and enforced by the president, whether it's the EPA in terms of environmental regulation, or the FTC or the FDA, and on, the alphabet agencies that run so much of government regulation and government enforcement of many aspects of life. And yet nobody seems to be really, that I've heard, concerned about this concentration of executive authority over immigration policy, the same way we're starting to hear more and more concerns about executive overreach of authority in some of these other areas. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think that it's a complicated question, because there are many reasons to be concerned about the scope of executive power over immigration law, not because it's necessarily bad for the White House or high-level officials to be setting priorities and trying to shape the way the system operates. But instead, and this is one of the arguments we make in the book, the concern, at least in immigration law, arises because so much immigration policy today, and so many of the political debates that we have, and then the government solutions that arise from those debates, are channeled through a system of enforcement, a system that consists in arrest, deportation, raids, coercive, especially coercive mechanisms for controlling people's movement and people's behavior, and mechanisms that don't just affect the individuals who might be ensnared in the system and deported, but obviously the people with whom they associate, and then the communities in which they live. And that then has an effect on the way in political debate and the political culture we think about immigration. It's something that's lawless, it's something that's dangerous, as opposed to being a source of strength or economic dynamism, or a domain where we should be thinking in humanitarian ways. So it's the channeling of immigration policy through an enforcement regime that is of concern. And we make a twofold argument on that front to try to think through how to address that concern. The first is that, and this may seem counterintuitive to you, but it's actually important for the president and high-level officials to be able to control that regime in order to set priorities. And we spend a fair amount of time describing the law enforcement culture within the immigration enforcement agencies, and the difficulty of shifting that law enforcement culture toward a regime that takes into account why someone might be entitled to relief, that might have sympathy for the dreamers and express that in enforcement policy. It is the case that if you think of the president and his officials as empowered to shape the system, then you might end up with enforcement priorities like the Trump administration's, which we disagree with for many reasons. So that's a subject, it could be a subject of debate. But our view is that over time, as long as you have the system that we do, if you don't have officials who are able to exert leadership and control what's going on in the bureaucracy beneath them, that there's no chance for injecting humanitarianism into the system. So that's the first approach. But then the second approach is that it is vital to think about what aspects of the system give rise to abuse or have within them the potential for abuse. And our view is that the enforcement domain has just grown way too large. There are too many millions of people subject to this power that is really a form of social control, power to dominate individuals and people who are otherwise integrated, but who don't have security of status or a confidence in their longevity in the country. And so that requires not hamstringing the president, but reforming the system root and branch so that it moves away from an enforcement focused model and towards a different kind of system. That, however, is where the legislative gridlock that you were describing is an impediment. And so, especially because it looks like, though we don't know as of this taping, that we're going to have divided government again, that might be elusive. And yet, it is important to continue defining how we would reshape the system so that when an opportunity for legislative change occurs, it can occur. And as part of that, one of the contributions that we hope to make is that when thinking about how to reshape the system, it's important to think about how the presidency can function in a constructive fashion and to disaggregate the potentially abusive characteristics of it with the constructive and generative aspects of it. And there are ways to integrate executive governance and executive decision-making into a better, more humane immigration system that can take advantage of what is constructive about executive power while still eliminating the potential for abuse.
Well, and I think, I do think there's legislative gridlock and has been for quite some time, and maybe that's part of why there is this impression and reality that there's greater power in the executive branch because it's easy. It's just so much easier for the president to issue an executive order, just in terms of the process involved, the lack of any real oversight into that. Maybe some court challenges can be brought, but that doesn't happen immediately, compared to Democrats and Republicans, increasingly polarized, having to actually get together and make law.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I wonder, and you're right, we still don't know the fate of the Senate. There'll be 2 Senate runs in Georgia in January that will determine that. But, in the meantime, take, for example, the family separation policy.
Yeah.
I mean, just a horrendous, I think, criminal policy. And mostly Congress has just sat through the last 4 years sucking their thumbs. I haven't done anything about it. They have the power to do something about it. The president, it's been left to public interest groups filing lawsuits and challenges, but Congress, as the legislative branch, has done nothing. So I wonder, because one of the other factors that we've seen, one of the other forces we've seen in the last several weeks actually, if you count early voting and mail-in voting, is an unprecedented turnout in a national election and greater participation from the voting public than we've seen in 100 years in this country. There are ways for individuals to exercise their voice apart from the vote every 4 years for president. For one thing, if we appreciate that the executive does have this greater power, you can make the issues that you care about, like immigration, more a part of what you think about when you vote. And you can also apply that to how you vote for members of Congress who might actually do something. I mean, what do you see that, what we've just seen in terms of voter turnout in the last in this election? How do you see that playing into these power dynamics that have grown over the decades?
Yeah, it's an enormously complicated question, and I'll start just by making one observation about congressional response to executive action. I do think, with respect to family separation in particular, which led to revulsion among Americans generally, it hits people in a very visceral way to think that our government would do something to that effect. And the revelation that there are more than 600 children whose families still cannot be found is really heartbreaking and devastating indictment, more than anything else, perhaps, of this administration that's outgoing. Mm-hmm. But there are ways that members of Congress have responded that I think have helped shape the debate, primarily through oversight. And in the time of divided government, when the Democrats, who are the opposition party to the president, are in the minority, there's not much that can be done by way of of legislation, but forms of oversight and making the issue of one that's publicly visible is a way of forcing the administration a little bit back on its heels. And that was part of the political pressure, the public pressure that led to that policy being renounced, even though much of the damage has been done. And the court decisions were obviously also crucial to that. But I think that the challenge for immigration reform related to what you're positing about voter turnout and participation is that it has never been an issue that has mobilized the masses in favor of immigration, right? And I think this could have something to do with why it's often something that the presidents advocate, or you see emanating from the articulation of presidential priorities. And some of that has to do with the fact that non-citizens are obviously not voters. And when we're talking about migration from abroad, we're talking about people who don't exist. And so it's often, a third tier priority for people who go out, the regular person who goes out to vote, they care mostly about the economy, healthcare, today, controlling COVID, things of that kind. Which is not to say that there's not a great deal of political mobilization around the issue, because there are significant interest groups that have always pushed for different kinds of immigration policy. So you made a reference to the exclusion of Jews. In the 1920s, the Congress adopted the national origins quotas, which kept to a very low minimum immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe. It was Southern Europe, but primarily Italy and Eastern Europe, and that was mainly targeting Jewish immigrants. And those quotas were essentially on the books until 1965, when Lyndon Johnson led a major, with obviously partners in Congress, a major overhaul of the immigration laws. And it was interest groups that helped to bring that into fruition. Ethnic lobbies, the Italian-American lobby, Jewish organizations, and then the State Department, concerned about foreign policy implications of excluding people based on national origin. And that was all fitted into a larger civil rights narrative of the era. And there was obviously enormous popular mobilization around civil rights legislation, but very little of it had to do with immigration that piggybacked on the ideals of the movement. But elites and interest groups kind of pushed that through. And today you see, advocacy organizations, Latino organizations, other organizations that represent Muslim interests or Asian Americans who organize around immigration. But it's not a matter of mass mobilization. And in fact, it would be.
But that's fascinating to see how those issues tie together to produce the change. And I can see here, Adam is the one described as having a background in voting rights law. But if there is one thing that comes clear from this election, it's there needs to be a greater focus and hopefully reform on access to voting. And we've come through a time, and we're still in a time of voter suppression and disenfranchisement, which just seems astonishing in the year 2020, that any political party or campaign could be based on not counting votes, no matter what the propaganda or PR says, on disenfranchising people. And if you have 11 million people who have been effectively citizens of this country, but they lack legal papers, who are disenfranchised from the vote, I mean, is there a way that those issues could intersect to bring about, to elevate those issues in a way that perhaps brings about some important reform?
It's a perceptive connection that a lot of people don't clearly see if they're just thinking about these issues casually. I do think that efforts to restrict access to the vote and keeping the numbers low, which seems to be, in the view of some Republican politicians, in the interests of the party, reflect a similar kind of I don't know if it's psychology or a theory of the electorate as policies that are designed to keep immigrants out of the polity. The effort to try to count in the census people based on their citizenship so as to exclude non-citizens from apportionment, and the refusal to legalize the unauthorized population as a way of keeping them out of the voting population, which it would be predicted to enhance the power of one party over the other. They're all related to an interest in keeping the United States, frankly, as wide as possible, but also keeping out interests that might shift the balance of power increasingly away from a party that's having a hard time winning majorities in presidential elections. And I think that also underscores that the way in which, and this is difficult to parse out, but the way in which immigration has actually played a major role in politics is through a politics of resentment, using immigration and immigrants as examples of outsiders who might ruin things for everybody else, take away jobs, cause crime, bring disease. That is highly effective and has been a tool of the Republican Party in recent years, but I think is related to this deeper desire to keep our democracy small, I would say, even though.
I mean, when Trump campaigned in 2015 and 2016, immigration was a big part of his agenda, I guess, or his messaging, and it was a very racialized agenda. It was not just about what do we do about this immigration policy in some dry sense, it was about politics and it was about race. I don't think there's any question. And labeling the other side in a way, open borders, they didn't want to let masses of people into the country. It was also very racial.
Yeah.
In the same way that this time he talked about, why don't you love me in the suburbs? I'm keeping those low-income housing people away from you. I mean, it's the same dark message.
The coded language is not really coded anymore, and it's all part of a strategy that implicates immigration.
So what would you project we're going to see on the issue of immigration? I mean, the Biden transition people have already put it on kind of the top 4 or 5 day one.
Mm-hmm.
The border reverse those, as we said a couple of times. Are there other ways in which this era of executive power over immigration that you think we could see change in any meaningful way out of this new president?
So I think that there are 2 reasons why the president-elect has already announced a series of day one and first 100-day kinds of actions on immigration. The first is because this is a domain where the president has a lot of power and where he can quickly undo things that his predecessor has done. There are a number of presidential proclamations that President Trump has issued, the so-called Muslim ban from the first week after his inauguration, and other restrictions on the entry of different kinds of non-citizens that can easily be undone. And because it's the power of the president, it's not really going to be susceptible to legal challenge. And there are a lot of examples of that kind of action that would be quick, and that the laws actually give the president the power to do. But the second is, I think that much of what the Trump administration has done strikes at the soul of the country, right? Strikes a lot of people as being inconsistent with what our values ought to be, even though the country's never fully lived up to them. And it's an opportunity to set an entirely different tone by saying, we actually welcome asylum seekers. Or we believe in refugee protection, even though, of course, there needs to be vetting and you can't let everyone in at once and there will still be enforcement at the border. It's a different message, a 180 from the fear and exclusion that was characteristic of all of the Trump administration's policies, from the visible ones all the way down through really picayune bureaucratic ones. And so it helps to set an agenda to take these positions that reaffirm a vision of the country that is in sync with other aspects of the Biden-Harris agenda on racial justice or helping workers and things of that sort. So for both of those reasons,
international place and foreign relations. I mean,
exactly, yeah, cooperative place as opposed to an isolationist place. Mm-hmm. So that makes it an appealing set of early actions to take.
Well, I'm excited to see those. I'm sure the Biden folks are eager to actually get going. In the next few days, that will happen. Will start to happen. Well, I'm sorry your co-author Adam couldn't join us, but it was such a great pleasure to get to know you, Cristina, and to talk about this important issue and to be able to look forward to some positive change that a president, even if it turns out he is clashing with a Congress still controlled by the other party.
Yeah.
There's some really positive things that can be done through the executive power on immigration and on some of the other areas we touch on. So I will be looking forward to that. And I'm going to hold up a copy of the book too. So, it is called The President and Immigration Law by Adam Cox and our guest Cristina Rodríguez by Oxford University Press. Really clearly written and with great background on this topic. We will put a link to the book in the description for the episode so people can just click and get right to it. And thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to talk. It's a good moment to be having this conversation, and but it's an ongoing one.
Sure, it's a great moment. In the time of lots of things to be really, really worried about, this is something maybe to be hopeful about. So I appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.